Nearly 2 million years ago, one of our ancient ancestors, Homo erectus, figured out how to control fire. And ever since then, through the ages, we have discovered more and more efficient sources of fuel to power our ever-growing civilizations. One of those sources of fuel is coal, still used today, but not nearly as much as it was in its heyday. Coal is a non-renewable energy source that is formed over millions of years from the remnants of decayed plant matter. Now, in the past, Earth was covered in a lot of dense forests, which produced a lot of this plant material that over time, after becoming protected from oxidation, either by becoming covered in mud or water, turned into peat bogs. These peat bogs were, in turn, buried under massive amounts of sediment, and over millions of years, the heat and the pressure of being buried removed all the water and turned the peat into what we now know as coal, with most of it being deposited during the Carboniferous and Permian periods, which was a range from about 358 to like 251 million years ago. Now, there's evidence that long before coal became a staple of society, that human beings have been using it for a source of fuel all the way back before civilization arose. But the earliest truly recognized use for coal comes from the Shenyang area, where by around 4000 BC, the Neolithic inhabitants of the area, they were carving ornaments out of the black stuff that they found in the ground. And from its humble start in China, the use of coal, and well, the uses for coal, began to spread all around the world, as pretty much every civilization has found a use for coal. The first recorded discovery of coal in America was by the French explorer Louis Joliet during his years exploring the Mississippi River between 1673 and 1674. The map that he drew shows that along the shores of the Illinois River, a major tributary to the Mississippi, that there was charbon de terre, or coal of the earth. Now, people had been using coal in the colonies for a while now, mostly to heat their homes in the new coal-burning stoves that were being made, which you might not think is a big deal, but even just the change from families having to gather, chop, and then store large amounts of firewood to using coal was a big game changer. Now, for the men who were usually responsible for doing that task, now they found themselves with much more free time. Though, for the women of the time, they probably didn't like having to clean out the much sootier stoves after a coal fire compared to a wood fire, so kinda sucked for them. And it didn't take long, though, for coal and its potential use as an energy source to be seen by the industrious. By the year 1701, near Richmond, Virginia, coal was already in commercial use, being mined and sold by independent miners, or being imported from Britain. And in 1769, James Watt, well, he significantly improved designs on the steam engine, which changed the game again and was a major catalyst for the Industrial Revolution. And by the late 1900s, coal production in the United States, it had been almost tripling every single year, making it a very huge business and obviously very profitable. But with the growing need for coal, that of course meant the need for coal mines, and coal miners grew as well. So as mining and railroad companies expanded their operations, they needed to also expand their labor force. And during these times, it wasn't like today where you can live in one city and work in another. The time it took to get places, it just didn't allow it. So the majority of workers, especially miners, would live very close to, if not on the property of the mine and the mine owners. These little towns, made up of the workers, they were called company towns. Now, in these towns, in these company towns, everything was owned by, well, of course, the company. The house you lived in, the schools, the churches, the stores, everything was owned by the company, even the law. And many companies would actually pay their workers with company scrip, not money. This was like types of vouchers that were only good in the company-owned stores and nowhere else. George Mortimer Pullman, who made his early fortune by helping the developing city of Chicago raise their buildings so that they could put in a new sewer system, also came up with the idea of a more comfortable passenger car for people who were taking overnight trips on the train. Now, at first, his luxury train cars, they didn't really take off, but after one of his train cars, the Pioneer, was featured in Abraham Lincoln's funeral train, the demand for his train cars, they completely soared. So, with growing demand and a growing workforce, Pullman decided he would create one of his own company towns. The Pullman Palace Car Company bought 4,000 acres of land between Lake Calumet and the Illinois Central Rail Line south of Chicago, with the company breaking ground on its new town in the year of 1880. And by all accounts, the homes that he built for his workers, they were actually nice and clean, and they were spacious, nicely built, good materials. And he also built churches and libraries and places of entertainment, and there was markets, and of course he built the factories. Now, of course, he didn't provide these things for free. Pullman believed that if people didn't pay for things, then they wouldn't value them. So he did charge rent on his buildings that would ensure him that he would make at least a 6% return on his investment into the town. Now, up until 1893 and the panic, which we will talk more about in a bit, the town was doing okay. It wasn't perfect for the workers, but people could make a living. That is, up until the demand for Pullman's fancy train cars, they dropped drastically. And old George, he responded to this by not only cutting back the hours of his workers, but also by lowering their wages, all while refusing to lower rent or decrease any of the prices on goods in the company stores. This led to the Pullman Strike in 1984, where, after Pullman fired some protesting workers, the entire rest of his workforce went on strike. His workers, they joined in with other members of the American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, and they planned to force Pullman to compromise by setting a nationwide boycott on Pullman train cars. Within 4 days of the boycott starting, around 125,000 railway workers left their jobs instead of handling Pullman train cars. Now, the railroad owners, they responded to this by hiring scab labor, temporary replacement workers, which obviously only increased tensions and eventually led to violent outbursts between the strikers and the scabs. With pressure rising and violence becoming more and more common, the federal government, they were forced to step in. And, well, really, the mail system alongside the train, like the railroad system, was also getting really messed up because of the strike. And the government, they didn't like that at all, so they really wanted it to end. Now, at first, when federal troops showed up in Chicago on the night of July 3rd, 1894, Eugene Debs, the leader of the railway union strike, he was happy. He thought, okay, great. Now that the troops are here, peace can finally return and we can have an amicable end to this whole ordeal. But no. President Grover Cleveland had sent the troops there with one mission: to get the trains running again. 12,000 U.S. Army troops, led by Brigadier General Nelson Miles, went from city to city, town to town, breaking the resistance of the strikers. The governor of Illinois at the time, when he found out that the president had sent federal troops to his state, he did request that they be withdrawn, but the president told him that he had a legal and a constitutional responsibility to the mail. But in reality, he just wanted the trains running again because it was hurting not only the country's economy, but also his own personal economic interests, as well as the fact that he had a railroad and mine owners alongside a bunch of other leaders of industry in his ear, basically telling him what he needed to do. In the end, after the U.S. Army was done crushing the strike, 30 strikers lay dead, with another 57 being seriously wounded, and Eugene Debs, the leader of the Railway Workers Union, well, he was in prison. The Pullman Strike was one of the first times that showed the government would be on the side of corporations and their owners' interests over the people, the workers. And it won't be the last. Back in Pullman, where we started this little side story, things didn't get better after the strike. Even though public sentiment was against Pullman for his refusal to negotiate with his workers and his terrible policies, he remained in control of the company and the town up until his death in 1897, with his grave having to be covered in tons of steel and concrete so that no labor activists could desecrate it. In 1898, the Supreme Court of Illinois, they did order the Pullman Company to sell off all of its non-industrial land holdings, therefore ending the company town. Now, I'm sure you can imagine how much life would suck if you lived in a place where the company you worked for owned everything around you and could pretty much do anything they wanted to you. And let's just say you went to the government to ask for help. There'd be a good chance that you wouldn't get any help, and in fact, you would probably just end up getting fired. And hey, maybe even shot. This is what life was like for many of the coal miners and their families at the time. They worked long hours, 12 to 16-hour days, sometimes even more, for little pay, with zero regard to the safety for the long or short-term health of the miners. And they had to deal with things like black lung being a huge problem. I mean, these men, and I say men, even though some of them were still children while digging out coal with their bare hands and no type of breathing apparatuses, all while living in a town where you basically had no rights. I mean, their safety and their lives meant nothing compared to how much it meant to the mine owners that they turned a large profit. The Steuben shaft at the Avondale colliery was situated right along the banks of the Susquehanna River, built in 1867 by the Nanticoke Coal Company, which was a subsidiary of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. It was a 327-foot deep single-shaft mine that gave access to a nice vein of anthracite coal. Now, single-shaft mines, they had already been banned in the UK after the 1862 Hartley colliery disaster, where the beam holding up the pumping engine snapped and then fell into the pit, trapping the men inside. After days of rescue attempts, some successful, in the end, 204 men and boys lost their lives in that tragedy. Knowing how dangerous single-shaft mines were, you'd think the company in charge of building the mine at Avondale would have taken some precautions, like building another exit. But no, this was the most economic way to build the mine, and why waste time digging a whole other tunnel for another exit when we could just get to the mining real quick, start making this money real quick? They ended up needing another one. At some point during the morning of September 6th, 1869, somehow, the coal breaker, which is the plant where the coal is brought to and then broken down into different sizes, well, the one that sat right on top of the shaft at Avondale caught fire, and within the span of a few minutes of someone noticing the fire, the entire shaft of the mine, which was stabilized by the wooden frame that held it up, was completely in flames, with the entire day shift stuck inside the mine. This is a quote from James M. Corrigan, who was the writer of a research paper on the incident. In almost an instant, an incredibly short space of time, everything combustible about the entire works was in flames. A line of fire extending from the Bloomsburg Railroad track below to the head house above, a distance of not less than 300 feet. When in full progress, the night was grand beyond description. Imagine a plane of fire running up at an angle of about 33 degrees toward the hill above, and after it has accomplished that distance, see it shoot up in one immense column into the air, while dense clouds of smoke envelop all surrounding objects, and the reader can have a faint idea of the spectacle. Now, as the fire grew and more people became aware of the disaster, a massive crowd began to gather around the burning building and the mine shaft, at one point reaching an estimated 10,000 bystanders. Sadly, a large portion of this crowd was actually the family and friends of the men and boys stuck inside the flames. So you had people crying and freaking out all over the place. Rescuers began to pump water into the well to try and help stop the flames, and by 5:30 in the evening, the fires they had died down enough on the breaker so that a pulley system could be set up. At first, to make sure the mine was safe for the men to go in, the rescuers sent a dog down into the mines. And thank goodness, the dog was fine when they pulled him back up. The next to go down into the mine shaft was Charles Vartu, but when he signaled to be brought back up and got back to the surface, he said that the mine shaft was blocked by timbers and that 2 men would be needed to help clear the debris. Charles Jones and Stephen Evans were then chosen to go down next with some hatches to break away the obstructions. They reached the bottom of the shaft around 7 p.m., and after a few minutes, they too signaled to be pulled back up. And when they reached the top, they said that they had found 2 dead mules and had banged on a closed door but received no response. A little while later in the evening, 2 other men volunteered to go down into the mine and see if they could locate one or any of the missing men. Thomas Williams and David Jones descended into the mine and never came back out alive. Both men were found dead by another man who went in to check on them. They had died due to black damp, which is a combination of high levels of carbon dioxide and low levels of oxygen that causes things to choke slowly to death. It wasn't until 3 a.m. on Wednesday morning that the rescue team was able to penetrate deep into the main gangway of the mine, and it was there, about several hundred feet down the tunnel, they found the first 2 human victims, the stable boss and a young mule driver. They were found with their bodies bloated and blood oozing from their mouths. At around 6:30 a.m., some rescuers reached the east gangway where they found a makeshift barricade made out of coal, rocks, and, wood and mud, looking like the miners had quickly tried to throw something up together that would stop the spread of black damp. It didn't work. When the rescuers broke through the barricade, they found a sight that probably scarred them all for life. Grouped together in every possible position lay the dead bodies of 67 men and boys, some appearing as if they had quietly dropped asleep, while others seemed to have struggled with their impending fate. Some of them, latter, laid with their faces buried in coal dust in the floor, in the vain attempt to find a current of fresh air. Others' hands were clasped to their throats, while not a few of their faces were wrapped in their shirts. One father, Mr. William P. Evans, was stretched out with a son closely grasped by each arm, with a third lying between his legs and his head resting on his father's breast. Another father, Mr. Hutton, lovingly embraced a young son, and all appeared as if sweetly sleeping. Mr. Evan Hughes, the inside boss, was sitting down with his head bent forward upon his breast and with his hands clasped in front of him, while another body was reclining a few feet distant, with his face turned to Mr. Hughes, as though he had been engaged in a conversation with him, but a moment previous drawing his last breath. What had been the conversation of these 2 men will only be revealed at the last great day. Had they been considering the chances of success, Or was each leaving with the other a parting message to dear ones at home to be delivered in case either survived? A passage from James Corrigary's report. In total, 108 people lost their lives in the Avondale mine disaster, with 72 women being left as widows and 158 children being left fatherless. This accident practically destroyed the small community of Avondale. Now, since this was an accident, nobody was blamed for any of the deaths, though some people, they do think that it was an act of arson that caused the fire, that started the fire, but no evidence of that ever really came to light. And that's not the point. That's not the point at all. The point is the mine was unsafe, and it was unsafe to begin with, and the mine operators knew that. Everybody knew that. In fact, the Working Men's Benevolent Association, it was founded in 1868. It was a union, mostly consisting of miners. Well, they had already petitioned the Pennsylvania state legislature for a new Mine Safety Act, which explicitly stipulated that all the new mines being built had to have multiple entrances and exits and better ventilation systems, for the miners. But because of a man by the name of George Turner, who at this time was the Democratic state senator, I believe, from Luzerne County, well, because of his efforts, those stipulations, they didn't apply to mines in Luzerne County, where the Avondale colliery was located. It wasn't only unsafe working conditions that the miners were having to deal with. They were also having to deal with mine owners that cared very little, I mean, not at all really, let's be honest here, about the well-being of the miners when they weren't working, and if they could take care of their families or not. I mean, I think we're all used to owners and bosses that don't actually give a crap about their employees, but the miners and their families, they were dealing with guys that almost didn't even really see them as human. Henry C. Fick was a massive coke dealer. No, not that type of coke. The coke he dealt with was just the product you get when you heat up coal in the absence of air at like 600 degrees or something like that. It's just another type of fuel source. Henry originally made his wealth by being the grandson of the very wealthy Abraham Overholt, owner of the famous Overholt whiskey distillery, which is actually responsible for America's oldest continuously maintained brand of whiskey. It's Abraham's portrait you actually see on the bottles still today. Now, I'm just kidding a little bit about how he got his wealth. Really, at the age of 21, he and his two cousins, they acquired a single beehive oven in which they would turn coal into coke to be sold to the different steel manufacturers in the area. And by the time 1880 came around, thanks to large amounts of loans from his family's friend Andrew Mellon, who was a very wealthy American businessman from the Mellon family dynasty, Henry was able to buy out his cousins from what was the Frick Coal and Coke Company and gain full control of the business, renaming it to the H.C. Frick and Company. This company would eventually come to control 80% of all the coal output in Pennsylvania. Now, just to get a little context here and kind of see what kind of mindset these guys have, before I tell you about Frick and the Morewood Massacre, I'd like to tell you about another story that you've probably never heard of, another tragedy, and that is probably because of the calculated and concerned efforts of the people responsible for it to bury it, and to never again speak publicly of what happened in Johnstown, 1889. You see, Henry and his buddies and all the other very wealthy owning class people, they don't like hanging out with us dirty poors. So they like to build places where only they can go. And one of those places was a beautiful little place called the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which was located high above the city of Johnstown, nestled in the mountains of Pennsylvania. The club had been established in 1891 when Benjamin Franklin Ruff and Henry Fick came up with the idea of opening an exclusive club for the wealthy and elite of Pennsylvania. Benjamin Ruff, he'd already purchased the land that the club would be built on from John Riley, who was a Democratic member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Also, with this purchase, the club became the owner of the South Fork Dam and the water reservoir behind the dam that the club named Lake Conemaugh. Now, the dam was originally built back in 1838 by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but over time it was sold to the private railroads and then finally sold to Henry Fick, where our story really begins. Since 1891, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had grown to 61 members, all the top industrialists from the coal, railroad, steel, and other industries in Pennsylvania, as well as their families. They had built cottages all around the lake and, of course, the clubhouse. And they also made some alterations to the land that wasn't in the best interest of safety, let's just say. They decided it would be a good idea to lower the dam by about 3 feet so that it could be widened and a road could be installed on top of it, making it faster and easier to get up to the club and their cottages. And they also decided that a fish screen needed to be put into the dam spillway because I guess they just didn't want any fish escaping their private little lake. It also really didn't help that John Riley, the guy who sold it to Benjamin before he sold it to Frick, well, John thought it'd be a great idea to take out the relief pipe, the system of relief pipes that were originally installed in the dam, just in case, to help with floodwaters. He took those out, cut them up, and then sold them for scrap metal. So now, the club owners had no way of controlling the level of water in a dam that they just lowered by 3 feet. And over the years of being in charge, the club owners, they never really made any meaningful repairs or upgrades to the dam. In fact, it said that when the dam was, when it sprung a leak, and apparently it did commonly, they decided that they would just get it repaired with mud and straw. It was on May 31st, 1889, that the president of the club, Elias Unger, woke up to a raging storm, and when he looked out the window of his farmhouse that was situated on a hill just above the dam, he could see, through the pouring rain, that Lake Conemaugh was completely swollen from the rainfall that had been going on for almost a day and a half now. The first thing Elias did after gathering a small group of men together was to try and unclog the fish trap over the spillway that had become blocked due to a bunch of debris. He then sent some other men to the other end of the dam to try and dig out some channels for the water to escape there, hopefully, and, lessen pressure on the dam. Now, while Elias and his crew of men worked to try and save the dam, he also ordered a man by the name of John Park to go to the small town of South Fork on horseback and warn the people there of the danger of the dam collapsing since they were downstream, and to telegraph at Johnstown, who was a little bit farther downstream, and warn them too. But John, he didn't go himself. He only sent some unknown guy, nobody knows who he sent, to the telegraph station, and in the end, no warnings ever reached Johnstown. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on May 31st, 1989, the center of the South Fork Dam collapsed. Elias and his crew, they had abandoned their efforts in saving the dam, and luckily for them had retreated to high ground. They and a group of others, they watched as about 3 billion gallons of water emptied out of the lake within 45 minutes to an hour. The floodwaters, first they hit that small town of South Fork, but luckily the town was on high ground and most of the people there survived except for 4 unlucky souls that were swept away alongside about 30 houses. It wasn't much farther downstream where the floodwaters were stopped briefly by a stone bridge, but all that did was allow the water to pick up more power, and when it burst through again, the wave of water was traveling at a much faster rate of speed than it was before. And that's when it slammed into the very small community of Mineral Point, where about 30 families lived. After the waters had rushed through Mineral Point, there was nothing left. No houses, no roads, not even the topsoil was left. The water had stripped everything down to the bedrock and also left 16 people dead. The next little village to be hit by the floodwaters was East Conemaugh. Here, an engineer named John Hess was sitting just outside the town in his train, and he heard, possibly even saw the floodwaters coming. So, he put his train in reverse and sped back to the village to warn people. And because he did that, he ended up alerting many people of the danger and saving many lives. But still, when the waters did reach the village, John and the train he was sitting in was actually swept away. Luckily, he did survive his ordeal, but for 50 other people in East Conemaugh, that was their last day on Earth. And just to top it off, the floodwaters, which were already full of broken trees and huge rocks, broken debris from houses and barns, and the bodies of humans and animals, right before the waters hit Johnstown, they washed over the Cambria Ironworks in the town of Woodvale, picking up train cars and miles upon miles of barbed wire. Less than an hour after the dam had failed, the wave of water and debris hit Johnstown, traveling at about 40 miles an hour, and in some places is said to have reached up to 60 feet high. And because of the warnings not getting through, most of the people of town were caught completely off guard, with hundreds of people being immediately trapped and killed by the waters inside their homes and places of work, or being crushed by the debris inside the water. Many other people became entangled in all that nasty barbed wire and drowned. In the center of Johnstown was a stone bridge that stretched over the Conemaugh River. Here, the debris and the bodies began to pile up, and somehow the pile caught on fire. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense if there's a bunch of water everywhere, but somehow it did, meaning that for some of the people who were washed downstream but still alive, just trapped under all the debris, well, they burnt to death. It's believed up to about 80 people died at the bridge in the burning piles of debris, which took 3 days to finally go out after the floodwaters had receded. 2,208 people lost their lives in the South Fork Dam collapse, making it one of the largest loss of civilian lives in America's history. It was originally 2,209, but there was one man who apparently pulled himself out of the debris, and instead of telling anybody or doing anything, he just walked out of town and moved to Massachusetts, and then 10 years later came back to town and was like, oh yeah, dude, I totally survived that, so yeah, you can take one off the death toll there. So yeah, that man's name was Leroy. 99 complete families were destroyed during this tragedy, meaning that whole family was just wiped out just like that, 99 of them. And I also hate to say it, but 396 of the deaths were kids, so that frickin' sucks even more. Like, I don't even know what to say. Just absolutely terrible. You can visit over 700 unidentified people at the Grandview Cemetery, where many of the victims of this horrible accident are buried. Now, with over 2,000 people dead, you might be thinking somebody was held accountable for this. You know, somebody faced some consequences. No, not at all. In fact, the investigation into the incidents led by the American Society of Civil Engineers concluded that the dam would have failed no matter what, even if the alterations made by the club never took place and they had just left the dam in its original state. But it turns out that initial investigation was actually very compromised, with evidence coming to light showing that the members of the South Fork Club, well, they used their wealth and connections to compromise not only judges and juries, but also the American Society of Civil Engineers themselves, and in turn protected themselves from any legal or financial repercussions. It actually took the ASCE 2 years to finally release their initial reports, and they had hoped, by waiting that long, that people would have forgotten all about the accident and nobody would care anymore. And in the following years, the club and its members, they were sued, but every time they were successfully defended by two lawyers who just so happened to be a part of the club. They argued that the failure was a natural disaster and an act of God, so nobody could or should be held responsible, and nobody ever was. No victims of the tragedy ever received any form of compensation. Now, you might think I'm getting my info mixed up here, but no, no, no. 2016. Remember, this happened in the 1890s. 2016 was the year where finally, after another analysis on the dam failure was done, that it was confirmed that yes, the stuff that the club owners did to the dam 100% caused its failure. So, just to make my point clear here, these people, the wealthy and elite members of the South Fork Country Club, fancy, they altered the dam full on knowing that it was destroying its structural stability, and that in doing so would make it so that the dam wasn't able to withstand a large, prolonged rainfall, which was bound to happen sooner or later. And then when that did happen, it led to a massive failure and the destruction of whole towns and villages, entire livelihoods, entire families just swept away in the flood. And after all that, after basically causing all that loss of life and property, these guys then turn around and tried to, sorry, not try to, tried to, but did. They didn't try to, they did wipe their hands clean of the problem, using their money and connections to power to get away scot-free, and practically erase this event from public conscience. These are the types of people that we will be dealing with going forward. No morals, no conscience, at least not for the poor people and the working class. All they care about is their profits and their reputations amongst the social class that they are a part of. They are also a group of people not scared or unwilling to use their wealth to gain access to power, and then to use that power to further their own political and economic interests, even if it comes at the cost of the so-called people. It was only a few years after the Johnstown Flood that Mr. Frick found himself having troubles with his mine workers. You see, for economic reasons, the coke industry in 1890, it took a big hit. And Frick, he had to close about 20% of his coke operations, which led him to also having to temporarily lay off quite a few workers. But by the spring of 1981, things were back on track and the miners, they did show up back to work, only to find notices put up by Frick that they would now be receiving pay based on how much the price of coke was at the time they were going to sell it. So if the price of coke all of a sudden dropped, then the miners' pay would too. Unlike before, when they were getting paid a fixed rate like we do nowadays. Like imagine you go into work one day for the company you work for and the stock of the company dropped, and you look at your paycheck and instead of paying the $20 an hour they normally pay you, now all of a sudden you're getting 10. Now, it wasn't just Mr. Frick doing this, but since he was the guy who owned about 80% of all coke production in Pennsylvania, he was looked at by the miners as the head of the snake. But he and the other mine operators, they didn't care. Instead, they began to bring in new workers, mostly recently arrived immigrants from Europe, and using force to actually evict the workers who were beginning to protest, alongside their families. And again, they were able to do so because most of these people, again, they lived in company towns where everything, including their homes, was owned by the company they worked for. And it didn't take long for the miners to get angry, watching their homes be taken away from them, their families forced into homelessness and starvation. I mean, they really had no other choice. So, on March 30th, 1891, about 1,000 miners, accompanied by a marching band, they set out towards the Morewood Company Town, which was owned by Frick. And when the group reached the town, they immediately started to trash the company store alongside some other company-owned buildings, and when they felt satisfied with their work, they moved on to the gates of the Morewood Company works. When they arrived, there at the company, the gates, they were of course shut. But also waiting for them was Captain Lore, who was a Civil War veteran, and also 12 other men who had recently been deputized by Frick. And without warning, the 13 guards opened fire on the miners as soon as they reached the gates, killing 9 men and injuring many, many more. And that was that. That was the end of the protest. The 13 guards, they were acquitted. They never faced any charges, and things carried on. Tough luck for the miners. Sucks to be you. Maybe if you had some money or something like that, I don't know, maybe got together, banded together, and formed a dumb little group of miners, fought for a better life for each other. Well, that's exactly what they did. In 1890, the United Mine Workers of America was founded. Now, before 1890, there were multiple little unions or attempt at unions in different states, but they were never going to be powerful enough to go toe to toe with the mine operators. They just simply didn't have the money or the power to hold out on any prolonged strikes, and didn't really have the fighting force needed to go against the private agencies, and sometimes even federal troops. In 1865, the American Miners Association was created. It was actually created by British miners who were used to much better and safer working conditions and better pay when they were working back in England. They were able to grow up to 20,000 members at one point, but due to the efforts of mine owners and mine operators, over time their membership drastically dropped. None of the owners would hire anybody if they were in the union, so there wasn't really a point of being in the union if you couldn't get a job because you were in the union. And eventually, over time, it just kind of stopped being a thing, kind of failed, the American Miners Association. But some historians, they do credit this little labor movement here as being the first labor movement in the history of the United States. It wasn't until a few decades later when the Knights of Labor and the National Progressive Miners Union merged together that the United Mine Workers of America was created in 1890. Now, the Knights of Labor are a little weird. They started out as a secret organization of tailors. Now, what these tailors were secretly planning on doing, I don't know, but it eventually morphed into a labor union that actually banned any bankers, land speculators, lawyers, liquor dealers, and gamblers. They only allowed the lower class workers to join. But again, by the late 1880s, they too were losing members, and were looking to join forces with other organizations to create a union that was on a more national scale. Now, another huge problem with a lot of the early unions in the US was the fact that they were competing against each other. Different unions wanted different things. Some were much more owner-friendly, while others were much more on the side of the workers' rights. So early on, most of these strikes that happened, they ended up kind of just fizzling out because most unions, they didn't have enough members, and most unions failed because they never ended up following through with what they promised the miners. Now, it took years of meetings and negotiating, but finally, on January 25th, 1890, the two groups finally came together and drafted a constitution, which had 11 points, and they were payment of a salary commensurate with the dangerous work conditions, payment to be made fairly in legal tender, not with company script, provide safe working conditions with operators to use the latest technologies in order to preserve the lives and the health of workers, provide better ventilation systems to decrease black lung disease and better drainage systems, enforce safety laws and make it illegal for mines to have inadequate roof supports or contaminated air and water in the mines, limit regular hours to an 8-hour workday, end child labor and strictly enforce the child labor law. Now, that's a really good one. Can't believe they're trying to get rid of child labor laws right now in the US. What the heck is going on there? Have accurate scales to weigh the coal products so workers could be paid fairly. Payment should be made, again, in legal tender. Establish unbiased public police forces in the mine areas that were not controlled by the operators. And the final one was the right to strike. But they said that they would work with the operators to reach reasonable conclusions to negotiations if strikes occurred. The first big test for this new union would come shortly after its founding, when in 1893, things got bad. The Panic of 1893 was a pretty bad depression that had many causes, as like most depressions do, and it really, really hit the mining communities hard. Even more pay cuts, more mine shutdowns, causing mass unemployment. People were losing their homes and being forced out of company towns because they couldn't pay rent. It was a very, very tough year. And in 1894, when mine operators around the country announced even more wage cuts, well, that was the final straw. The United Mine Workers organized a national strike to begin on April 1st, 1894. Now, at this point, the union was still pretty small. It had around 20,000 members in total, but only around 13,000 of those members were actually paying any union dues. So the bank account, it wasn't looking too good. It only had around $2,600 in total that the union had to spend. Even though the union only actually had a small amount of miners in it, their call to action led over 180,000 miners across 5 different states to walk off the job and not return to work. In Illinois, over 25,000 miners went on strike, compared to the only 600 that stayed at the job site. That's pretty good. It didn't take long for the mine operators to start bringing in scab workers and strike breakers, and shortly after that is when this peaceful strike turned into an armed labor dispute, with acts of violence spreading across mines and company towns in various states. Now, the miners, they weren't asking for anything special. They just wanted their pay to return to normal. But the mine owners, I guess, just couldn't fathom not making as much money as they were used to making, and they refused to budge. I don't know. I guess these people need to see that every year, every quarter, every report that somehow, some way they were making more money than they were before, or else they get anal about it. These rich people, they have the weirdest mindset. They will do anything they can to avoid having to spend more money. During the Fukushima disaster, when the owners of TEPCO, the company that owned the nuclear power plant in Fukushima, well, when they found out that the man in charge of trying to stop a nuclear meltdown at the plant was planning to inject seawater, salt water, into one of the reactors to cool it down, they called him and threatened him and made sure that he didn't do it because it would ruin the reactor. And they were hoping that maybe in the future they could use it again. Yeah, that led to the reactor overheating and exploding, causing the second worst nuclear disaster in history, only behind the infamous Chernobyl event. I just don't get it. Me, if I was one of these owners of one of these mines and I'm super rich and everything like that, I'm good. We're in a depression. I'm okay. I'm fine. I've been fine, and I'll continue to be fine. Me and my family, we're already wealthy, and we'll continue to be wealthy after this, We're not struggling. We're not starving to death. So, in my mind, I would be okay, maybe for the next couple years, a year or so, let me take a little bit less profit than what I'm used to getting, maybe even half of it, and then take that profit that I'm used to getting and then give it back to my workers, the ones who are freaking out there working hard every day, but also struggling and starving and becoming homeless and shit. Right? Help the workers out a little bit, pay them a decent wage so that we can all make it through this together, or not even together, but just make it through. Avoid this whole national strike thing that's going on, avoid all this fighting and people dying because they don't see any other alternative besides working to death in the mines. I feel like this whole turmoil could have been avoided. But no, Violence quickly spread. In Scottsdale, Pennsylvania, a group of women, they went to march on the coke ovens in town in hopes that they could convince the scab workers there to leave. But some guard decided to shoot a rifle at the crowd of women, and that's when the men who were striking jumped into action and caught the guard and severely beat him. While over in Virginia, another group of women, they caught a man who was importing slaves from down south for one of Henry Frick's operations, and they just beat him up too. They also tore out his beard. In Spring Valley, Illinois, the miners, about 200 of them, they had a full-on medieval-style battle with strikebreakers using wooden clubs and stones to fight them off the worksite. And then a little while later, 50 deputies showed up and they charged the miners, managing to snag one of the ringleaders, who they then threw in jail. But not long after that, the miners showed up again, this time outside the jail, rushed the building, smashed their way inside, and in the end, they actually managed to free their leader and escape. On May 23rd, in a place called Unionville, armed guards, they opened fire on a group of protesting miners, killing 5 people. In another town, DuQuoin, Illinois, 700 miners, they managed to capture a coal train, and then they took it to a town called Centralia, where they destroyed the mine that was there. And then in Grant, Indiana, another 1,000 men also stole a train and brought it to the mine at Pana to destroy that mine as well. But this is where the strikers messed up. You see, the government doesn't like it when you mess with its money, and in this case, the miners stopping shipments of coal, stopping trains from running just in general, well, it quickly led to the federal government getting involved. Because now they weren't just interfering with the mine owner's business, but the government's business. And really big business and government, I mean, they go hand in hand anyways, so they weren't having that. A new law was drafted making the blocking of trains illegal, and then federally funded militias began to protect mines, trains, factories, and also the workers who weren't on strike, like the new scab workers, were now being protected by federal troops. As for the miners, things, they weren't getting better either. As the depression only got worse and the strike lost steam, and more and more miners, were actually forced back to work, simply just due to the fact that they and their families were starving to death. They couldn't hold out any longer. As well as the fact that some mines were actually able to stay open during the strike at a time where the demand for coal wasn't that high. So those mines, they kind of evened out the production and need for coal. But for a little bit, the strikers, they really did have an effect on coal production in the U.S., with one shop owner saying that it won't be long until there isn't enough coal in the market to boil a kettle of tea. But after 8 weeks of striking, by the end of June 1894, most of the strikers had gone back to work and the strike was over. The United Mine Workers of America had failed in their goal of getting the mine operators to return the pay to normal, but also failed to establish themselves on the national level as a union that could actually get things done for its members. And with the failure and the end of the strike, the union itself also came to an end. Well, not really, actually, but it almost did. It was practically non-existent for the next 25 years until a man named John Llewellyn Lewis became president of the union, and through his efforts, the union will one day become a majorly successful and huge union. So I lied to you just now. It's not the end of the union, and it's not the end of the struggle of the miners and the fight for a better life. And not even close to the end of the labor disputes that have taken place in America. So hopefully you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you back next time when we continue to look at a history of coal and labor unions. Thank you for your time. Have a good one.